Thank you, Jay, for that very jazzy introduction. I feel like dancing up here. And thank you to all of the ESI staff and the volunteers for making this event possible. I am just so honored and thrilled to be here and tell you about bees and why I love bees and why I think everyone should care about bees. But it's not just about these charismatic creatures, but also about what they do for us. So the subtitle of my talk is How They Improve Our Lives. And I really hope that's something you take away from this talk today, that they're beautiful, charismatic, wonderful creatures, but they also really help us. And so, no pun intended, bees provide us a buzz with coffee. They're coffee pollinators, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the talk. So just to give you an overview of where we're headed today. So before we start, I'm going to start off my talk talking about pollination. Give you a little bit of visual and some examples. Then, of course, why bees are great. Followed by different types of bees. So one of the common misconceptions I'm hoping to dispel is that we have more than just honeybees. We also have thousands of species of native bees, which you'll hear about. And then I'm going to end with how you can help. And throughout this talk, I'm going to tell you about some research that folks in my lab are doing, some collaborators, as well as I'm going to talk about food. So, beginning with food, I don't know about you guys, but my favorite meal is breakfast. And it's because there are so many delicious, sweet and savory foods that we all get to enjoy. And this is a pretty beautiful looking breakfast, right? So this was a photo that my friend and collaborator Laura Russo took. She's at Penn State University, because she wanted to highlight all of the foods that pollinators provide us. Now, can you guys tell me which of these items is pollinated by an animal? Yes? Honey. Or honeys provide that to us. Okay, yeah. What else? Jam, yes. That's strawberry jam, let's say. Strawberries, What else? Apples, very nice. Any others? Okay, in the back. Oh, yeah. Oranges, orange juice, good eye. What else? Nuts, that's right. So some of the almonds and walnuts, Yep. All of the fruits on here. What about what's on the omelet there? Some salt. Down here in the first row. Raspberries, good job. You might have seen this talk already. All right. Okay, so let me show you now. So this is our breakfast with pollinators. Let me show you what this breakfast looks like without pollinators. Ooh, that's a pretty sad looking breakfast, right? So starting from the left, right, on top of the granola, we had blueberries and cranberries, almonds, the salsa, tomato salsa on your omelet, the raspberries and blackberries and strawberry jam. We also, nobody noticed in the cup where there's milk right now, there was coffee. We also got the orange juice and then the apples and the honey on the side. So a lot of these items are dependent on pollinators, and that makes us dependent on pollinators for a healthy diet. Okay, so what is insect pollination? So insect pollination basically is the act by which pollen moves from one plant to another, and an insect helps to move it there, and specifically from the male parts of one plant to the female parts. And that can happen within a single plant, or they can happen between plants and between flowers on different plants. So just to give you a visual, if we have these large orange circles representing our pollen grains, and we have a bee visiting, the pollen sticks to the body of that insect, this bee, bumblebee right here, and then when the bee moves to another flower, the pollen is carried with it and is deposited onto the stigma or the female reproductive parts of that plant. And then what happens is this flower will develop into a fruit, right? So what does it look like when you go from fruit to flower? So let's start off with the strawberry jam, right? If we think about strawberries, if you go from flower at the far end all the way up to a developing fruit, what we can see is that flower will slowly, once it's been fertilized, will slowly engorge and become sugary and sweet and will become a juicy strawberry. Well, what about something like an almond? So here's an example of the series for almonds, where we start off with almond blossoms on the left-hand side. You can see that flower still remaining and the fruit developing right inside of it in that second picture. Then that fuzzy green fruit can be cracked open, and inside you have a seed, which has that delicious almond on the inside. So a lot of our food items come from pollination, but what does it look like when you don't have adequate insect pollination? So this is an example of a strawberry on the far left that had lots of insect pollination, and these strawberries that had limited or no insect pollination. Now, which strawberry would you guys like to eat? One on the left, right? Pollinator strawberry, exactly. All right. Okay, so now I want to move on to, we talked about lots of fruits and nuts and vegetables, but my favorite fruit is the mango. And I wanted to tell you about my favorite fruit because it actually was the gateway for me to become a biologist. It's one of the reasons I got super excited about how species interact with their environment. So the word species means, a type of organism, and why these different organisms, when they interact with each other, produce amazing benefits in our lives, like mangoes. And this is something that my grandmother taught me, because my grandmother happens to be a small-scale mango farmer. So she had a mango orchard behind her country house, and when I was a young child, she used to take me for walks in this orchard and tell me all about the different interactions that made a mango fruit possible. So that included, water, precipitation, putting manure and fertilizer on the trees, and also pollination. So can anybody guess what kind of pollination a mango system is? What insect might pollinate a mango? What about in the back over there? Yeah, you. Yeah. I'm sorry? Butterflies. That is a very good guess. All right, I'm going to give you a hint. They sometimes get stuck in your house, fly around. Flies, yeah. So mangoes happen to be fly pollinated. There are some bees and other insects that visit, but it's predominantly fly pollinated. And you can see a mango flower on the right here. And on the left-hand side, you can see a baby mango, a little mango that's starting to develop. So it's a flower that's been pollinated. It's now developing into a fruit. So I got super interested in this interaction and decided to study that a little bit further. Okay, so aside from mangoes, how much are pollination services actually worth? And if we think about it, it's a huge fraction of our diet. It's about 1/3 of US crop species, 2/3 of global crop species depend on insect pollination. And that is worth about $18 billion a year just in the US for US pollination, and about $200 billion a year at the minimum globally. So it's a huge economic force that insect pollination provides. Now, so I've told you a little bit about the value of pollination. Turns out a lot of really charismatic animals pollinate. So I don't know if you guys saw the beautiful tables out in the science fair area talking about bat pollination. Bats are very important pollinators. We also have beetles, which are very important pollinators. So this is a beetle crawling out of a magnolia flower. It's got pollen all over its body. Butterflies, I could go on and on. Flies, other types of sucking insects. We've got a huge number of species that pollinate. But today, I'm going to focus on bees. And the reason I'm going to focus on bees is because they're a special group in that they've evolved to really focus on plants, and specifically on pollen and nectar. So bees are the vegans of the insect world. So unlike their ancestors, the wasps, they are pure vegetarians. So they just eat pollen and nectar. And what that means is over time, they've evolved specialized structure all over their body to collect and store pollen. So if you guys take a look at this bee here, where do you see the pollen? On his butt. That's gross. His belly. That is right, his belly. So you're right, the pollen's not on his head, it's on the back end of its butt and belly. And so what about this one here? Where's the pollen there? Stomach. Where else? On his legs. I thought someone was going to... His wings too, okay, maybe a little bit, yeah, there's some on the wings. I thought someone was gonna say armpit for sure. But yeah, we've got a lot of pollen on the arms and legs and belly here. So it turns out that where the bees actually store their pollen is a key feature in helping us identify what kind of bee it is. And it also makes them really specialized in being pollinators. So bees, unlike other groups of insects, also tend to visit many types of species of plants, so many different types of plants, and they're also loyal. And what I mean by this is that they actually have a memory, and they tend to go back to the same type of flower multiple times consecutively, so many times in a row. And there have been studies on bumblebees that'll show that they can remember for about 30 seconds or so, and they'll actually go back to the same species or the same type of flower. Now, that would be good for a plant, right? Because then you get pollen from your own species on you, right? Instead of getting pollen from many different species. So this ends up making them really effective pollinators. The other reason that that bees are really good pollinators is that they're messy. So what do I mean by messy? I'm going to show you a picture of a really messy bee, and you'll see what I mean. So this bee, very messy, right? It's got pollen on its face, on its eyes, right? Now, this picture I love because it reminds me of a little kid. You know, it's got food all over its face. In fact, I'm going to show you a comparative picture here of my daughter, who's in the front row here, eating blueberries, right? And she'll end up with blueberries in her ears and her hair, right? And although that's challenging for a parent, it actually is really beneficial for the plant in the case of a pollinator. And that's because the more pollen that's kind of all over the place, the more likely it's going to fall onto that female reproductive part. So there have been studies that have shown that the pollinators that are really good at grooming are actually less effective because they end up dropping less pollen. So there's an advantage to being messy if you're a pollinator. All right, so coming back to our breakfast here, let's focus now on honey. So honey was one of the first examples you all provided and what bees provide us as humans as benefits. So let me talk about honey for a little bit. So what is honey? Honey is stored, regurgitated, and evaporated nectar. So who knows what regurgitated means? Okay, what does it mean? Barfed, okay? That's one way to put it. Right, so this is basically thrown up nectar, right? So, but it sounds really terrible, but the reality is that nectar is this incredibly fragrant secretion and sweet secretion that plants produce, right? But it's not very viscous and it's not very concentrated. What happens when a bee ingests the nectar, it swallows that nectar, and it regurgitates, or it shares it through vomiting with the nestmates, and then brings it back to its colony, is that in that process and through evaporation, so that basically bees will fan the beehive, that nectar starts to evaporate and it starts to thicken, right? And that's when we get that thick, very sweet honey that we all love. And I put a picture up here also to show you the lavender. So how many of you guys have noticed when you buy honey, it'll often specify the type of flower it's coming from? And that's because that nectar carries the fragrance of that particular type of flower. And so you can follow that fragrance of the nectar all the way to its honey stage. Okay, but what I want to note is that not all bees produce honey. In fact, it's a very small select group of bees that include honeybees, bumblebees, and stingless bees. And these are all social bees. So it's part of a social bee life cycle to collect and store honey. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So humans have been foraging for honey for at least 10,000 years. So some of the oldest pieces of evidence we have are these cave paintings from Spain from about 8,000 BC. And you can see someone climbing up a ladder or a pole, and she's got her basket to carry the honey, and you can see bees flying all around in a honeybee nest. And so humans have been taking part in basically harvesting from wild honeybee nests. But shortly after, and it's hard to date when this exactly began, but it's estimated to be probably about 8,000 years old, people actually started putting these bees in baskets, in hollowed out logs, and then a few hundred years ago, these boxes became very popular because they were basically less destructive ways to have a honeybee colony in your control as a human. Okay, so anybody know the name of the species of bee that makes the honey that you and I usually eat? Yeah, in the red shirt. Yes, they are honeybees. You know where they're from? The European honeybees, okay? European honeybees. And the species is Apis mellifera. And so I want to bring up the fact that they're European because that indicates that they are not native. So these are not native bees. They were brought by the European settlers and colonists. And so they've only been in this country for a couple of hundred years. They're social, so like the bumblebees and stingless bees I mentioned earlier. There's a queen, and she has many workers. And her workers are her daughters, so they're actually all sisters. And there are some males that are produced, but the vast majority of individuals in a colony are the sisters. And they all work together, these workers, to collect nectar and store this honey, and also store pollen that they then feed the brood. Now, the brood's another name, another way of saying the babies, right? So the baby bees, and also to feed the adults in times of scarcity. So getting at the baby part, the brood here, so it turns out when you see an adult bee flying around, that's actually just a small part of the bee life cycle. So bees spend almost half their life in a pre-adult phase. So what happens is a female bee, so in the case of a honeybee, it'll be the queen, will lay an egg. That egg will develop into a larvae, and then next it'll become a pupae, and then that pupae will start to get color and differentiate, and the body parts will start to form, and then eventually you'll get an adult bee emerge. So we don't usually see these early stages, we just see the adult bee stage flying around. But in the case of a honeybee, you know, that total lifespan is about 6 weeks, and 3 weeks of it are just in the colony in that development process. So to give you a sense of that, I'm going to show you a time-lapse video where you can see that 6 weeks sped up. Okay, so you see the egg there developing into a larvae, and that larvae is inside each cell here in the honeycomb, and you can see that white liquid is actually a secretion from the worker bees and a mixture, also a little bit of pollen and nectar. And then now you see the larvae starting to pupate, so you can see the body parts starting to form, and you can kind of see the head starting to form, and then this is the same pupation process from above. You can now see the head form. You can see some varroa mites. And now that pupae is starting to get color, the eyes are starting to get pigmentation, the brain and the inner organs are starting to develop. And slowly, you'll notice as they start to become close to adult, the worker bees will actually come in and you'll see little tongues going in and they'll be feeding them pollen and nectar. And then they'll start to move, and once they're adults, they'll start to engage in helping with the rest of the colony, going out and foraging, helping nurse the other bees, etc. All right. So bees, we see adult bees, it's just a small fraction of their life. Before they're adults, they're really dependent on pollen and nectar. And that's when these, in the case of honeybees, these worker bees are out foraging for them, right? So what are they foraging on? And in the case of honeybees, again, these are managed non-native bees. We keep them in boxes, and we move about 2/3 of them all the way. So all across the US, we take 2/3 of all these honeybee colonies, and we put them in the Central Valley of California for the almond bloom. And so these bees are being moved around quite a bit. Does anybody know how they're being moved around? Have you guys seen them? Yeah. On a truck. Good response. So I don't know if you guys have seen these, but there are these trucks that'll carry hundreds and thousands of these colonies out into these different orchards. So it could be orange blossoms, it could be almonds, and this is not quite natural, right? So if you think about it, this is not how bees have evolved to live, right? They are being moved around and forced into very close proximity. And this is one of the reasons that people believe that honeybees in particular might be exhibiting some declines. And so there have been declines in US honeybee colonies and globally in honeybee colonies, sharper declines since 2005. And these have been related to a number of different issues. Diseases that can happen when they're in close proximity and can happen due to these management, pesticide exposure, again, which happens when they're exposed to a lot of different agricultural fields. And there's also some genetic factors. So there's a lot of different things going on, but certainly our management is a big part of the problem, right? So what are alternatives? So in addition to improving the way we manage honeybees and thinking more about health and disease and pesticide exposure, there is another alternative, and that is our native bees, our wild native bees. So this is just an array of bees to give you a sense of the diversity. So there's estimated about 20,000 species globally, and we haven't identified them all. About 4,000 in the US and 1,000 just in Texas. So we have about 1/4 of the US bee species, which is pretty incredible. Texas is a bee biodiversity hotspot. So we should all be very happy to live in the company of this great diversity. So just coming back, I want to show you, just to give you a sense of scale, so these top bees are about the size of your thumb, so they can be pretty big. Kind of bees around the bottom here, kind of size of a pinto bean. And the smallest bees are about the size of a grain of rice. So huge diversity in size, and you can see all the different colors and shapes as well. Now, what I want to point out is that most of these bees, as I mentioned, sociality, or being a social species, is actually a very small group of bees. So most bees are solitary. More than 90% of them just live by themselves. It's a female that provisions her babies, her offspring. And the way she does that is she creates this ball of pollen and nectar, and we also call that bee bread, because it actually ferments in a similar way that bread does. And then that egg will form into a larvae, and just as you saw in the honeybee video, it'll eventually develop into a pupae and then an adult bee. And the other thing is that most of these bees also live in the ground. So a lot of people don't realize that some of the most important nest habitat for bees is below your feet, underground. All right, okay, so coming back to breakfast, somebody mentioned earlier, right, that animals are bee pollinated. So I'm going to tell you a little story about one of the best, apples. Apples are bee pollinated. And apples are predominantly pollinated by leafcutter and mason bees. So I'm going to show you a picture of a leafcutter bee here. And I remember when I first saw this picture, I was like, it looks like it's on a hoverboard or something. This bee is just jettisoning through the sky on this little piece of leaf. And they not only cut up leaves, they cut up petals. And they're not just trying to be destructive to gardens. What they're actually doing is they're collecting material to build their nests. So they take each of these little pieces of leaves and they use it to line holes that then they can use as structural support to build their nests. And so just to give you a sense of what those look like, if you were to pull one of them out, they end up being like a long kind of tube, and this particular tube might hold 2 of these cells. So you see the larvae and then the little pollen ball, again, that bee bread that I showed you earlier. These are the ones that have the really fuzzy bellies that I showed you. We also call them the hairy belly bees. So they're really a really fun group. One of my favorite bees are the euglossine bees. They're really interesting because sometimes they live by themselves and sometimes they live in groups of their sisters. They're just gorgeous. You see them in red and green and purple, and they're very metallic. And they have mystified biologists for centuries. And recently we've been able to uncover some of the mysteries and answer some of the questions that we've had. So one of the first ways that they've mystified biologists is that the males and females both visit flowers very intensely. And this is unusual, right, because the males don't provision the babies, right? It's just the females that are provisioning the babies. So what are the males doing on these flowers? So can anyone tell me which of these is the female? Yeah, in the blue shirt. Bottom one. Why do you think it's the bottom one? Okay, that's a good, you got it. It doesn't have as much color because it has more fuzz. You're absolutely right. It's fuzzier, and it has this little ball of pollen on it. So scientists were just baffled. What is this male bee doing at an orchid flower when we know it's not collecting pollen for the babies? So it turns out, after many years of study, that these male bees are collecting cologne. They're going out and they're collecting these resins to impress the ladies. And so the males collect cologne, and what this has done, it's provided the framework for thousands of years of coevolution between euglossine bees and orchids that has led to just an incredible array of interactions. Now, this is just one of my favorite videos. I'm going to show you. So this is a male orchid bee, and it's flying towards an orchid, where again, it's going to collect its cologne. And so it approaches the orchid, and it's cued in on that very wonderful scent that the orchid's providing. But the orchid structure is such that that male euglossine bee has to fly up into a tunnel. And that tunnel is very slippery. And more than that, at the bottom of the orchid, there's basically a bath of this sticky solution that the plant produces. So here you see the male orchid bee. He's trying to grab a hold, and the scent resin is just up in there in that tunnel, so he has to climb in there, and he's actually going to collect that cologne and put it in his legs later. But he's going in there, and he's trying to get the cologne, and in the process, because it's shaped like a tunnel, and it's kind of slippery, he falls in. And he's in this very sticky solution, and so he can't get out of the sides, out of the kind of a normal exit point. He has to follow a very specific route out of this orchid. So there's a narrow tunnel he has to climb through. So he climbs and climbs, and this is the only way out of the orchid. And so he's climbing up through this tunnel, and in the process, he finds himself in a place that's exactly the size of his body. And so he's squeezing his way through, and in that process, that is when the orchid places, if we anthropomorphize, the orchid has pollen. It has 2 little pollen sacs, and inside each of those pollen sacs, there are thousands of pollen grains, but it's the only pollen sacs this orchid makes. And so it wants to glue them. It glues them on the back of this bee, and it holds that bee in that position for an hour or more, until that glue dries. And so people have studied this, and there's actually a series of chemical reactions that basically opens up the flower, but it takes a really long time. And in that process, those pollen sacs get stuck onto the bee, and then you can see him make his getaway, and you can see the pollen grains on his back. So those are the pollinia sacs. So inside, there are thousands of grains. And then what he does is he goes and flies to another orchid. And what happens is, as he's visiting that next orchid, when he falls into that sticky solution, that solution actually acts to dissolve the glue. And that pollen sac falls off and pollinates the orchid. So I love that story, and I love National Geographic for making those amazing videos. But it highlights the importance of bees, not only to the foods we eat, but also to plants across the planet, including orchids, which are just gorgeous organisms. Now, I'm going to quickly move on to another important group of tropical pollinators, and those are the ones that pollinate coffee. So I don't know about you guys, but I know some people who, if they haven't had their coffee, they're not very pleasant to be around. In fact, my husband, if he doesn't have his coffee, it's a pretty scary morning, right? So we're all many of us are dependent on coffee. And I think coffee pollination is an important thing to talk about because it also influences the way that coffee is managed. If we think about what the coffee plant actually needs in terms of pollination, we would manage coffee in a very specific way. I want to mention coffee also because this was really the subject that brought me to graduate school and pushed me to pursue research. And that's because when I was an undergraduate, I studied abroad in Ecuador, and I visited a shade coffee farm. It was the first time I'd ever seen a coffee farm. And I remember, the first morning there, I had my binoculars, and I saw like 30 species of migratory birds in that one morning. And I thought, man, what is this place that provides us with this crop and this item that's important for humans, but also is this reserve, it's this place for biodiversity. So I got really interested in shade coffee, and I started to study that, and I decided I wanted to pursue that for my PhD work. And so this is a picture from one of the shade coffee farms that I worked in southern Mexico, and you can see the bushes in the understory here, and you can kind of make out the white flowers that are along each of the bushes. So those flowers will grow into coffee cherries if they're pollinated, and inside those cherries will be coffee beans. I don't know if you can see me there at the bottom. There I am. Just to give you a sense of scale. So you can see how tall these shade trees are. So I was working in one of the first certified organic coffee farms that's also shade-grown coffee. So many species of trees, and just an incredible biodiversity in terms of plants that live up in the trees, we call epiphytes. A really biodiverse place where they also grow coffee. So when I started my research there, I had a number of other collaborators that were working outside of Mexico, and all of us were finding a really interesting pattern. And that is that if you look here on the y-axis, I have the percent fruits out of flowers. So you can think about that. We know that flowers have the possibility of turning into fruits, but in the case of coffee, they have to be insect pollinated. So if you look at that proportion, right, we see that it increases with the number of bee species. So the more bee species you have, the more of your flowers actually turn into fruits. And that's important because inside the flowers are the coffee beans, right? They turn brown once we roast them, but they're usually they start off as green or yellow. And that's really important for farmers, right? So coffee yield increases with the number of bee species. Now, why might that be the case? We actually see this in a number of other crops as well, with melons, with blueberries and strawberries. And that's because different pollinator species will work on different parts of the flower and will pollinate different parts of the stigma. And so if you have more species, you have overall better functional or better kind of pollination across that whole flower. So we see higher yield when we have more bee species. What we also noticed in this research was that the bees depend on the trees, those shade trees I showed you in the picture, and the shade trees depend on the bees. So the bees need a diversity of shade trees to provide them with food to stay in the coffee farms. But the shade trees also need the bees to reproduce and to be pollinated. And then later we found in this study, because there was a bunch of hurricanes in my last year in graduate school, and what we noticed is that we actually went out and went to all the farms that we'd been working in, and after these hurricanes, we went and measured and mapped out the numbers of landslides there were. And it turns out that the more shade trees you have and the more diversity, so the more species of shade trees you have, the fewer landslides you have. So there's this connection between pollination and not only the benefits it provides us in terms of coffee or crop yields, but also the benefits it provides us indirectly by allowing native plants like these shade trees to reproduce and survive. All right, so coming back to coffee, one of the most important pollinators of coffee are what we call stingless bees. So these are called stingless because they have reduced ovipositors, so that's where they lay the eggs. So only female bees actually sting because only the females have that egg-laying device. So these are social bees. So they live in pretty large colonies. And they've been managed by indigenous communities for thousands of years. So this is a Mayan Melaponine bee manager, and they often manage them in hollowed out logs. And because they're stingless, in some ways they're a lot easier to work with than honeybees. But just because they don't sting doesn't mean that they don't defend themselves. And one of the neat things that they do is they actually will have one female who will stay at the front of the nest and she's kind of like the bouncer at a club. You know, she basically makes sure that no one who's a foreigner to this colony and no parasites, et cetera, can get in. And then the other thing they do, they can't sting, so they'll pull your hair. They're kind of like, you know, a sibling who's just trying to get on your nerves. And if you don't think that sounds annoying, you just have to look at the face of my collaborator, Rodolfo Jaffe, as his hair is getting pulled by this colony of stingless bees. So Rodolfo, he came to UT a few years ago, and he wanted to do this study looking at how stingless bee colonies were related to each other, but he had to collect a little bit of DNA, so he had to get kind of close to the stingless bees. And they were pulling his hair, and they try and fly in your nose and in your ears. So although they're not stinging, they still know how to keep mammals like humans away from their nests. Okay, so now we've talked about coffee. Let's come over to our dried berries on top of our granola. So can anyone guess which bee is the best pollinator for blueberries? It's fuzzy. It's fuzzy. Bumblebees, that's right, bumblebees. So bumblebees are one of the best pollinators for blueberries and for cranberries. And they're also one of the species that's exhibiting the most pronounced declines. So our lab has really been interested in studying bumblebees, and we've been doing that for the past couple of years. But they're also very tricky to study because they nest underground. And it's actually very hard to find bumblebee nests. And so how do you find a bumblebee nest? It turns out you can use the faithful friend. You can use dogs. So let me show you this video. So this is Toby. He's a Springer Spaniel, and he's 4 years old when the video is made. And he has been trained by the British Army to find bumblebees. And specifically, you can see him kind of starting to root around in the grass a little bit. So he's been trained to kind of especially work in these heavily grassed and wooded areas. And he cues in on pheromones, on chemical cues that the bees exhibit. And the way he's learned to do this is with a lot of training. This is my collaborator, Dave Goulson, who has been training Toby. What Dave does, and with the help of a graduate student trainer, is really to get this dog to hone in on this the bumblebee fragrance. And they use tennis balls to kind of incentivize him to go out and find these bees. And it's important because we think habitat loss is one of the main reasons that bumblebees are declining. And so dogs like Toby can help in this process. But it took 4 years to train Toby. And I have personal information from Dave that Toby has his good days and his bad days, okay, as a sniffer dog. So using a sniffer dog can be tricky. And so what myself and colleagues, including Dave Goulson, have been using over the past couple of years is something we call DNA fingerprinting. So how many of you have heard of DNA fingerprinting? So you know the concept. So just in case you haven't heard of it, I'm just going to show you a little visual here of kind of what kind of information we use. So if you take this mom here, and she has her genetic information up here, and it's represented by these bands of color. So you can think of this as her DNA up here. And each spot is coded with different colors. And then we have a dad here. You can look at that DNA information and piece together that this child could very plausibly be theirs, right? Because she shares the same colors that the mom and the dad have, right? So we can use a very similar approach where we basically look at regions of the DNA and compare them between individuals. And this can help us identify colonies of bumblebees. Now this is useful because before this technology, before we had these tools, you could find 100 bumblebees and you didn't know if they were from 100 colonies or from one colony, right? But because all of the colony members in a single colony are sisters, we can look at how related they are and figure out how many colonies we have. Does that make sense? All right, so what we do is we go out and we sample a little bit of DNA from the bees, and then we compare all of those little bits of DNA across all of the individuals, and we count the number of total colonies that we have in a landscape. And that can give us, for the first time, a sense of the number of nests, right? And what we're finding is that we have greater nest densities in areas that have more natural wooded habitat, and lower nest densities in areas that have a lot of pavement. Now, this isn't rocket science. That makes sense given that bumblebees are nesting underground, but it's still, we just didn't have the data before to show it, to say, listen, putting a lot of pavement down is not good for bumblebees. So, and now we can definitively say that. The other thing that we can do is when we're collecting this DNA, we can also collect the pollen they're carrying, right? So they have, this is their little pollen sac, their corbicula on their leg, and we can look at this pollen, and then we can figure out what they're eating. So if you take pollen and you look at it very closely, and this is specifically under a scanning electron microscope, what you'll notice is that each pollen grain, each species of plant produces a very distinct pollen grain, right? And you can actually identify the species of plant the bee has visited based on those pollen grains. So the ones that are really spiky, those tend to be within the Asteraceae, so the plant family that has daisies in it. These are just guesses because this is a photo from Dartmouth. But these ones that look kind of like folded up bean bags, I think those are probably lupins. And so in our lab, we do this. We don't use a scanning electron microscope. We use just a regular light microscope. But we can figure out what the bees are eating. And what we've been able to see is that there are very distinct patterns in what they eat. So you might notice some of the plants on the left-hand column. Some of them might sound familiar. So we got daisies, poppies, lupins, got some mints up there. But what you also notice is the two different colors, right? So we have native plants in blue and non-native plants in orange. And so this was a study actually that 2 UT undergraduates did. So Mustafa Saifuddin and Alan Ritchie. They looked at pollen on bumblebees, and what they found was there is a pretty strong preference for native plants. It's about 90% of the pollen load was native plants, and about 9% was non-native plants. And we've been looking at this data further and looking at a number of other species beyond bumblebees. And this is work that my graduate student, Kim Ballar, has been advising to high school students. So how many of you, anybody here from Davy Crockett High School? Nobody from Davy, okay. Well, Davy Crockett High School is where Diana Joyce Ojeda is from. And from Bowie High School, we've got Lauren Doe. And they've both been doing research in our lab for the last year and a half to 2 years. And what they've been looking at is what bees eat in urban gardens. So they're looking at the pollen on bees, bees that were captured in urban gardens, and they've taken that pollen and are looking at it under the microscope, and what they're seeing is that the preferences for these different pollen types change over time. So it could be that you start off liking one type of pollen, and then a few weeks later you shift, maybe as those types of plants stop blooming, or maybe as other options become more available. But that's really important because we know that different pollen grains have different nutritional value. So just like you have hamburgers and salads, there is an equivalent in the pollen world for really, really unhealthy pollen and pollen that's really nutritious. But overall, having many species in your diet is really helpful. So just to talk more about this project, so Kim Ballar has been working in about 40 urban gardens across Austin and Dallas. And what she's been finding, just looking at the entire bee community, looking at all the different types of bees, is that there's actually a relationship between the amount of mulch and the number of bee species. So actually, the more mulch you put down, what ends up happening is you cover up some of that important bare ground, which is really important in bee habitat. And so while mulching is very important, it's very good for water conservation, keeping it limited to the areas where it can have that benefit is ideal, and leaving some bare area is really important for pollinators. The other thing Kim is finding is that in urban gardens in particular, having a lot of diversity in your local flowering species, so in the flowers that are blooming, having many different types of the flowers can be really beneficial to the bees. All right, so I'm going to end my examples here with I'm going to have you kind of step back further, so not looking at the food, but actually looking at what's behind the food here. this beautiful, colorful tablecloth, and the green napkin on the left-hand side, which are all made of cotton. So many people don't realize that cotton also benefits from insect pollination. And my student, Sarah Cusser, when she started her research in Texas, she talked to cotton farmers, and most of them were like, you're wasting your time. Pollinators aren't really necessary for cotton. But when she went out there and started looking at the pollinators, this is what a cotton flower looks like, and this is what the flower, once it develops into the bowl, so if it's been pollinated and it develops, we get this fibrous cotton bowl. What she found is that if you have insect pollination, you can have a 17% crop yield increase. So 17% more cotton than you would if you had no insect pollination. And that's a lot of increase if you think about it. It's worth about $100 per acre. So in this region in South Texas alone, it's worth more than $1 million, just if you had more insect pollinators. And the other thing Sarah found was that specifically, if you had kind of natural habitat fragments in your cotton farm, you were likely to have more native bees and more diverse native bees. So keeping a few little natural habitat fragments in your cotton farms could really help promote and increase the total amount of cotton that you got per flower. All right, so we're nearing the end of my talk. So I want to kind of quickly summarize some of the key points. And if you take away anything from this talk, these are some of the winners. First one, there are more than just honeybees. So about 20,000 bee species in total. Bees come in all shapes and sizes. So I showed you some really colorful bees, metallic and fuzzy, tiny and large. Not all bees sting. So many bees are, in fact, they have a lot of stingless bees, and most bees only sting if you are approaching their nest. So if bees are out foraging, they're usually not really looking to sting. Most bees are solitary, and they nest underground. So underground space is a really important habitat for bees that we should think about. And bees need food and shelter, just like humans, right? Pollen and nectar for food, and wood and bare ground and natural habitat for shelter. And bees are necessary for both human nutrition and ecosystem health. So again, if we think back to our strawberry example, the difference in terms of these two pictures is really clear how much we need these pollinators for our own diets. And we think about the impact on plant communities and things like erosion after a hurricane. These pollinators have a whole second layer of benefits they provide us. Okay, so then how do we support these native bees? What can we do? First thing is to preserve our natural habitat. And so in central Texas, one really important way to do that is to think about prairie conservation. So pollinators really depend on native prairies, and so thinking about improving the quality of our native prairies. Also, it's important to think about non-natural habitat that we all still have an important role in managing. So that includes urban and peri-urban habitat, as well as rural and agricultural habitat. So I want to bring you back to the coffee example. So this here is a very different coffee farm, right? So what do you notice between this farm and this farm, the one I showed you earlier? So what's different about this farm? Yeah, go ahead. Trees are smaller, so we don't have a lot of other trees. Yeah, what else? They're like little mushrooms, yeah. So yeah, we've got huge differences. And what that means is that in this farm, in this shade coffee farm, we've got a lot more diversity, a lot more biodiversity can be supported, including bee diversity. And that's really important for the conservation of bees. So thinking about agricultural products that are coming from places that sustainably farm is another very important way we can help bees. All right. Who here is from Laurel Mountain Elementary? All right. So Laurel Mountain is a great example for all of us. So this photo here on the left-hand side, you can see Mr. Trevor Hance and graduate student Megan O'Connell, who's in the CIRES program here at ESI. And they have been working together with the wonderful students of Laurel Mountain Elementary to put in place a pollinator garden. So great work, you guys. And and in addition, I mean, what this is it's inspiring, but it's also a great way to do science. I don't know if you guys got a chance to see their table, but they're actually doing experiments on this garden, and they're going to be looking at the recovery and the usage of these plants by different pollinators. So really amazing work. So if you're interested in putting in a pollinator garden, what are things you should think of? The first thing is you want variety, right? So I've shown you in a couple of places that plants need many different types of pollen. They prefer different colors, and thinking about that food over a longer time span is really important, because just like humans, they can't just have breakfast, right? They need food over a long period of time. So thinking about that shift and providing floral resources over multiple time periods is really important. They also need nesting habitat. So we talked about exposed ground, some dense thicket is also good, trees, and some dead wood are important to keep in your garden. And avoiding pesticides. So best practices, don't use any pesticides at all, but if you have to, really avoid spraying them when bees are foraging. So during the day, on flowers is where you should avoid spraying pesticides. And promoting native prairie restoration. So I mentioned earlier that Central Texas is a really important place for prairie restoration. And degraded prairies often need things like prescribed fire, as well as native plant seeding. So I bring this up because a number of agencies have been working on this. TNC and Texas Parks and Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife, and our lab is currently working on restoring a number of prairies all the way from Waco up to Tulsa. And one of the ways that we're doing this is by prescribed fire and by wildflower seeding. And we're really excited about this because we think there's a lot of potential to really bring back some of these natural regimes that support native flowers that are important for pollinators. I also want to mention this because there's a new program where historically people were incentivized to support management of wildlife such as deer and quail. And as of last year, one can now manage for pollinators and experience a benefit through tax evaluation. So if you're interested in this, do contact me or contact your county extension agent as we're trying to push pollinator wildlife habitat restoration as an option for all sorts of folks who want to get involved. So now to end, I want to show you a video from Grow Wild UK, which is the outreach extension of the Royal Botanical Gardens. And it just can give you a sense of what can be done in a very short time period. So what they do in this work is they take urban habitat fragments and they plant them with wildflower seed, or and it's really taking advantage of space that's otherwise not really being used and making it incredible habitat for pollinators. And so with that, I want to close with just some resources that we have on our website. So if you just Google my name, our lab will pop up and you'll see we have a bunch of species lists for different parks around the state, as well as just some tips for doing pollinator-friendly gardening in your own backyards. And with that, I want to thank you guys for your attention and thank my collaborators and my students and take any questions you might have. So thank you.
Thank you, Shalene. So we have time for a short Q&A session, and for those people who ask really good questions, we have signed photographs by Dr. Jha. So you either submitted them by Slido, or you can line up at these mics on either side, and we'll begin.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how much pollen can one, let's say 20,000 bee nest pick up over the lifetime of one queen?
Wow. Oh man. I would say multiple millions of grains. So we know that in our study, in a single day, a worker bee is picking up more than 1,000 pollen grains in a single day. So if you think about, depending on how many workers she has and how long her colony lasts, definitely, more than millions, yeah. Very, very good question, yeah. Yeah, over here.
Sorry.
Yeah, when it keeps switching, yeah, go ahead.
Where do you mostly focus on pollination? Like, where do you focus on mostly doing your research?
That is a very good question. So you saw some examples where we work in some farms. So we've been working in peaches, in cotton, and in coffee. And we're probably going to move into melons because those are also really important for the state. And then we're also working in urban areas. And we just started this project where we're working in native prairies in Texas. So along kind of that I-35, in basically a beltway from Texas to Oklahoma. So in a couple of different places. But really, pollination is important pretty much in every landscape, outside of the ocean. It's a really important topic. So we could work anywhere, but that's a great question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You didn't mention climate change, and climate affects all kinds of habitat. And for those that are interested, tomorrow at the Capitol at 1 o'clock will be probably the largest climate march in the state, and you're all welcome to come and do that. So could you mention about climate's impact on wildlife?
Absolutely. That is such a good question. I'm so glad you're asking. I actually had some more slides in there about climate, and I cut them just for the sake of time. But we do know one of the reasons that we think bumblebees are declining is they are the most sort of northern and southern latitude species. So they seem to be the most susceptible to increasing climate change and warming specifically. So there's a lot of data that suggests that high elevation bumblebees are the ones that are really getting nailed. We think that has to do with their dependence on flowers and the unpredictability of flowers in those communities. But that is a really important question to think about. As the climate changes, what there's potential for is what we call plant and pollinator mismatch. So where basically plants might flower before pollinators emerge, and that's a really major concern. I'd say that's top of the list as far as pollinators in the future. And as far as thinking about in restoration how to handle that, again, we're trying to think about diversity. So if you have more diversity, you're more likely to basically bridge those different time points. But it is a great question and a real concern. So yeah, thank you.
Shalene, we'll take one from the web from Slido. Mm-hmm. Person asks, how is DNA sampled from a bee?
Very good question.
Put a cotton swab in their mouth?
We actually basically take a little toenail clipping from them. And so we have this thing called a little bee squeezer. So we put the bee, we catch the bee in our net, and then we have it in this little tube, and it kind of presses the bee up so we have access to the little toenails. And then we clip a toenail, and we know there have been studies to show it doesn't actually harm the individual. It'll just keep on foraging. So apparently it has sort of no effect on the bee, but it allows us to get just enough DNA where we can map out their relationships without hurting the bee. Mm-hmm.
Which pollinator would you say is the most beneficial to the ecosystem?
Oh my, that's a tough question. So I would say I'm gonna kind of skirt your question and say that all pollinators are important. Really, it's about, I would say the most important thing are local pollinators. So the pollinators that have evolved and are from that particular area are the ones that have had interactions with the plants there for thousands of years. So those are the ones we really want to support. It's a very good question.
So just want to say we have enough time for everyone who's standing to ask a question, and then that'll be it.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask that, and you told us that bees, they can be underground, but how do they get there, and how do, when animals step on the ground, how does it not cave in on the bees?
That's a very good question. So some bees, like bumblebees, actually nest in old rodent nests. So they'll sometimes co-opt nests that other organisms have made. A lot of bees actually do dig. They're like digger bees that actually dig the holes themselves. Many of them nest a couple of inches underground. So what that does is that actually prevents them from feeling the impact of people stepping. But it's a really great question because one of our concerns with prescribed fires, with putting fires, is that it could hurt the bees. But the reality is once you get a couple of inches below the soil, the temperature doesn't actually get that hot in a fire. So bees are smart, and they go a little just deep enough to kind of avoid those sort of disturbances. So it's a great question.
What states do you find bumblebees in?
Oh my. I'd venture to say every state in the U.S. has bumblebees. And bumblebees are kind of special bees in the sense that, unlike other bees, you tend to find them more in northern states. So they're kind of the more cool adapted bees. They're fuzzier, it's kind of like they have a winter coat on. And so they've really evolved to live in cooler environments. So the northern states tend to have more bumblebee species. Great question.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering what the impacts of African killer bees moving north to the U.S. is.
Wow, you know your bees. Good for you. So that's a very good question. So what the audience member is referring to is that there has been an Africanization of honeybees, and that was due to, in the 1950s, basically bees that had hybridized with African honeybees were in Brazil and escaped, and that particular type of bee, honeybee, has kind of spread northward and is kind of in the southern U.S. And so most people think that they won't really progress too much further north because they're not very cold tolerant. But they don't really, you can still harvest honey from them, but they have a slightly different behavior. They're a bit kind of trickier to work with if you're a honeybee, an apiculturist. If you're working with the honeybees, they're a little bit more challenging. But we tend to not see them in the northern U.S. because they don't handle the winter very well. But in some ways, they've actually shown more resilience to some of those disease factors I mentioned to you. So some of the colony collapse disorder doesn't seem to be affecting the Africanized bees as much. So there are some potential sort of advantages that they experience compared to the non-Africanized European honeybees. So great question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So can you guys please, before you ask your question, tell us your name and what school you're from? We'd like to know.
All right.
Yeah, very good.
I'm Zach. I'm from the Austin area homeschool science team, and I was wondering, here in Central Texas, if you're keeping bees, which species would be most beneficial to the ecosystem here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so if you're keeping bees, you are, so I guess it depends on how you define keeping, right? So one thing you can do is create a lot of natural habitat or basically, promote natural bee nesting habitat and food availability in your own backyard. And in that way, you're kind of keeping bees. And I'd say that would be the most important thing to do to support our native local pollinators. If you're thinking more about a hive, most people, there are a couple of things you can do. There are hives, little boxes, wood nesting boxes that you can make. There are a whole bunch of great manuals online through the Xerces Society and the National Wildlife Federation that show how you can make nesting blocks for some of the mason bees and the leafcutter bees I showed you. So that would also be kind of promoting those bees. I think thinking local and supporting our local native species is totally the way to go.
And could I ask one more question? Which species of bee has been hit the hardest by all of these decline factors?
Yeah, great question. So it really has been the bumblebees that have been hit the hardest. And that there's kind of two reasons for that. One, we think they're the ones that are most sensitive to the high temperatures. They're the ones that are located, they're really dependent on high elevation, so mountain meadows. The other is that they've also been managed like honeybees, so there are many bumblebees that are used in the greenhouse industry. And so for that reason, some of the negatives that I brought up earlier about honeybee management are actually also faced by bumblebees as far as diseases and pesticide exposure, et cetera. So they've been hit the hardest, but really we also know the most about bumblebees because they're bigger and people have been studying them for longer. So we just really need to study more species. So, but very good question.
Thank you.
I'm going to just jump in with a question from the web.
Mm-hmm.
This person asks, what do you think about the possibility of drones replacing bees as pollinators?
Wow. So I almost included a slide in here. I don't know how many of you have heard about the human-mediated pollination that's going on in China for the almonds there. I don't know if anyone's seen photos. If you go online and just Google that, They don't have bees in some of these almond growing areas, and so humans actually go out with feather dusters and pollinate the flowers, and it's a lot of work. And I think that's not the way we want to go. As far as drones, I think that's another challenging, I think it's a much simpler solution to just support our native bees and not have to worry about any of the added challenges. Yeah, so, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any idea, like, what your views are on colony collapse disorder, like what you think is causing that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I kind of alluded to that a little earlier. So, colony collapse disorder is kind of this multi-factored, issue. There's a lot of evidence that it has to do with disease, and so connections between varroa mites. There's a fungal disease that they also get. There's a couple of viruses that they get, and part of it has to do with what I was showing earlier with them all being in one truck. It's kind of really easy to get viruses if you're all scrunched together. So it's diseases. We know that pesticides are also playing a role. And we think a big part of it is also nutrition. So these bees are kind of carted everywhere, and they don't have a stationary home. And that stresses them out and also changes their diet up and kind of forces them on very narrow diets for periods of time. So just not really healthy management seems to be one of the main reasons. So, but yeah, good question.
Are there any like plants in Austin that are like severely beneficial to bees?
Wow, that's a great question. So I would say, I put up the Wildflower Center logo up there on that side because they have a wonderful list of bee-friendly plants. But if I had to give you some names, bees really like things in the mint family and in the clover family. So things like mealy, like sage and horse mint. And so I would, and they also like daisies, they like a lot of flowers. So, but the best place is to go to the Wildflower Center, which I think you guys at Laurel Mountain Elementary did. So you already did your homework. But that's a great resource for local pollinator-friendly plants.
And also, am I supposed to say my name of my school? Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm Vaishnav and I'm from Laurel Mountain.
Yes, thank you.
You can continue. Tell us your name.
Okay, I'm Alex from Laurel Mountain, and I was wondering, since you said there were 1,000 species just in Texas, so since there are less in the other parts of the United States, does that affect the pollination? Or
Yeah, so there's about 4,000 species in the whole country, and about 1,000 of them are in Texas. So actually, as a state, between Texas and California, we have the most bees out of any state. As far as species. Now that's very different from abundance, like so how many total bees you have. And that's a really good question. I think that just like California, we have the most bees, but we also have the most crops, right? Both of those states. So we need our bees for our food production. And so in that sense, it's a major concern, especially in food producing areas of the country that specifically produce like fruits and vegetables and nuts. And so I think we should be really concerned as Texans because we provide so much food to the rest of the country. But we have the special opportunity. We have a lot of species here. We just have to think about how to provide that habitat to support them. So it's a good question.
Hello, my name is Zaid. I'm from Laurel Mountain Elementary, and I was wondering how much space does a bee need to burrow through the ground?
How much space do they need to grow? So every bee species is going to be a little bit different in terms of how. So the ones that nest underground, some of them nest very deeply, and the ones that have many sisters that they live with, so that we call those the communal bees, they need more space because they're all living in kind of like bunk beds, in a house, or multiple bedrooms in a house. So those need a bit more space. There are ones that are very solitary; they just live by themselves, so they need a little bit less space. And then the social bees, like the bumblebees, need even more space because they have often different chambers for different things. So they'll often have like an area that's a bit more for the brood. It might all be in one spot, but a bit segregated, a bit separated. So it's really species dependent, but there's a lot of variation. So yeah, good question.
I was wondering if all kinds of pollinators were extinct, what would the world be like? Would we be able to survive?
That is a very good question. It would not be the world we know it. You know, it would be it would be a much less diverse place. So, you know, as we said, about 1 in every 3 bites, or 1/3 of our crop species in the U.S. depend on pollination, about 2/3 in the globe. So the other thing to keep in mind is that it's some of our tastiest food. So the things that are not pollinator dependent, like rice and corn, and you know, those are edible. We eat them. They're very important parts of our diet, but they're not necessarily where we get our nutrients. So there have been a lot of studies that show that really it's about, we'd lose a lot of nutrients and you know, some of the vitamins that we depend on if we didn't have fruits and vegetables and nuts. So I think it'd be a pretty bleak place. Yeah. Good question.
I'm Paul from Laurel Mountain, and my question is how many bees, how many flowers do bees pollinate during their lifetime?
Oh wow, that is a tough question. I would say, you know, a single bee probably pollinates, you know, depending on which bee, how long it lives, but probably tens of thousands. So we know that within a day they can visit thousands of flowers, a single day. And many bees are foraging for a couple of weeks. So it's tens of thousands, and that is very variable depending on how long the bee lives. So I showed you some bees. Some bees only actually live for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. And then we have other bees that can live for a month. And then the queen bees and some of these social species, they can live for a whole year. So depending on how long they live also, that would influence the number of flowers, but it's a lot, yeah.
I'm Maya from Laurel Mountain, and I wondered what exactly in a flower would attract a bee to come to it. Like, if it's the color, like a pink flower would get more bees to it than a yellow one or anything like that.
Oh, that's such a good question. I had a slide in earlier about this. So, well, bees are going to flowers that have nectar and pollen, right? So they want to get nectar and they want to get pollen. And sometimes they go to some flowers for pollen and some flowers for nectar, right? So nectar is that sweet solution, and then pollen is those grains that have a lot of protein and amino acids. And so what we know is that they see a different part of the visible light spectrum than humans. So they actually can see UV light, which is not something you and I can see. But what that means is that when they're looking at a flower, it looks very different to them. And a lot of times, it actually will look kind of like a target. So we look at a flower and it just looks like a regular daisy, but to them, it looks like a target right in the center, like a dark spot in the center and bright around the edges. And so that really kind of channels them to the center of the flower where those reproductive parts are. We also know that, you know, some bees, if they'll just specialize on pollen for part of the morning, and then they'll switch over to nectar. So it also depends on kind of the time of day and what in the case of a social bee, what the colony needs. But they're really going to get pollen and nectar, and they're attracted to all different colors, but especially kind of the purples and blues, that end of the spectrum. Yeah, so good question.
How much nectar do bees get per second?
Oh, wow, per second. That is a good question. Well, so we actually have a researcher in our lab who's studying that question. She's trying to figure out what's more efficient. Is it more efficient to go into the front of the flower and drink the nectar kind of like you drink it out of a straw? Or there are some bees that we call robber bees that actually go into the side of the flower and they make a little hole. And they basically get right at the base of the nectary, where the nectar's coming from, and they can drink it right from the bottom of the cup. You know, so these robber bees, they call them, because they're not actually pollinating. They're not putting the pollen, you know, not carrying the pollen on their bodies. They can drink nectar sometimes a lot more quickly, right? Because they don't have to slurp it up through the whole straw. They can kind of go right to the base. But some bees, there's a lot of variation in bee tongues. So some have really long tongues, and those tend to be much faster at sucking up the nectar than the ones with the shorter tongues. It also depends on bee size. We know the bigger bees can just, suck up all that nectar really quickly. So I'd say there's a lot of variation, but the biggest difference would be the ones that actually drink it out of like a straw versus the ones that go in from the side. The ones going through the side are usually a bit faster. So yeah, good question.
My name is Susanna, and I go to Longview Micro School, and I was wondering what they do when the queen bee dies. How do they choose a new queen?
That is a great question. So it's a bit different for every bee species. So for honeybees that have been managed by humans for a really long time, they humans have been cultivating, managing them. So they've in some sense almost been trained to accept different queens. So honeybee managers can actually put in different queens. Sometimes the workers will accept the queen, and sometimes they won't. But honeybees have kind of evolved to be more accepting of queen replacement. But many bees, like bumblebees, for example, at the end of their colony cycle, the queen, she only lives for a year, so she'll be ending her 1 year of lifetime. But it's at that same time that she then produces new queens. So she produces the new queens, and as that original colony is starting to shut down, those new queens will go out and start new colonies. And so that's how that whole cycle continues. Those new colonies will form, their queens will run the colony for a year, and then right as they're starting to close down, they'll send out more new queens. So that's sort of how that turnover happens in colonies. A great question. Yeah.
So, you know how you did the thing about orchids? Do any other flowers do that?
Yes, there are many other examples of that. So if you want to spend some time on the internet, there's a whole set of what we call, they're all sorts of flowers that basically mimic pollinators. So the flowers themselves will look like a pollinator in order to attract the pollinator. And those can be, to attract the pollinator, so they basically engage in a physical action on the flower, so that will actually promote pollination. There are other flowers that have special scents that bees collect. The euglossine bees are the ones that are really specialized in those perfumes or those resins that they pick up, but there are many other species that do that. There are other flowers that smell like dead, rotting meat. They smell like a decomposing body, and they actually attract a certain group of flies. And there are some bees that actually go to that rotting meat, rotten smell. But what happens then is if you have a really peculiar smell, you're probably attracting a small group of pollinators, and those pollinators are more likely to visit that same plant species again. So in a way, you kind of are attracting a crowd that'll go to your species. So it's beneficial for you as a plant. So good question.
How do the bees build their nests?
How do bees build their nests? So they use all sorts of things. So they'll go out and collect materials. They actually do a lot of, like the leafcutter bees will do a lot of chewing up of the leaves and mixing. So the saliva plus the leaf tissue they can use to make their walls around their nest. Honeybees actually produce that wax that is used to make the honeycomb. So some of it is also their body secretions help form that structure. So yeah, good question. Mm-hmm.
How would you keep African bees from infiltrating your hive without harming them?
Wow. So that is so a number of folks are trying to beekeepers are trying to keep more European honeybees in their colonies. And what that tends to be based on, right, is the queen. So if you can keep a European honeybee queen, she'll produce workers that are European honeybees. If it's an Africanized queen, she'll produce Africanized honeybees. So what I know many beekeepers do is basically try and replace that queen if they feel like the queen might have already been replaced, and they're trying to keep that Africanization lower. But I think that's a tough question, and many people are working on how to keep it, simply because I think that the European honeybees seem to be a bit easier to manage. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Frida. I'm from Lanier High School, and I was wondering, when you give examples about bees pollinating plants, how they take the pollen from the male part and then put it on the female part, and then they reproduce like that. What if they pollinated one plant and then took the pollen to a different type of plant? What would happen? Does the second plant not accept the pollen? Does it still get pollinated?
Great question. I really like your headband also. So you brought up a really important field in pollination biology. So there are a number of people, even in our lab, that are looking at this of like what are the other species of pollen that end up on a stigma, on that plant female reproductive part. So there have been other studies that have shown that if you get a lot of pollen from other species, so not your own species, but a different plant species, that stigma can actually get clogged up. And that will prevent the pollen tube from growing and the fruit from developing. So it benefits a plant if the pollinator is loyal. And I brought up that term a little earlier in the talk, so that's when the plant visits the same species multiple times in a row. And one of the reasons is that the stigma clogging that can happen, where if you get a lot of pollen from other plants, it just kind of covers it up and makes it less accessible for the pollen of that same species. So it usually is kind of harder for the plants to reproduce then. So very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Jennifer from Lower Mountain, and I'm wondering, what does the pesticide affect the bees?
Yeah, so there are a lot of effects that pesticides have, and we have more data now on certain groups of pesticides, but the reality is that we need to study all of them quite a bit more. But there are effects that include, so at the most extreme, we know that they can kill bees, right? We know that they can produce the numbers of individuals in a colony. At a less extreme scale, we know that things like neonicotinoid pesticides can actually impair their orientation. So they'll go out foraging and they just don't come back. They don't know. We think it has to do with sort of how they relocate their colony. So we know it affects their flight and their orientation, and it probably also affects their lifespan as well. So a lot of different ways.
Thank you guys for all the good questions. We have to now hand out the photographs.